It's okay.
We can
wake me up.
upload previous. Good afternoon, everybody.
It's good to meet you.
Welcome to the first All Souls Criminology seminar of the term. Let me quickly scroll to the end. At the end of the seminar, we're going to alternate between having drinks in this room and going to the King's Arms. So this week we'll be here. So anyone who wishes to stay around at 5 and just chat informally for a while, you'll be extremely welcome to do so. Before we do that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Maximo Sozzo, who is Professor of Sociology and Criminology and Director of the Crime and Society Programme at the University Nacional de Litoral in Santa Fe in Argentina. He's currently based for a few months in Edinburgh, so he's made what on a bad day is the more arduous journey from Edinburgh to here than from Buenos Aires to here. In recent years, Maximo, as many of you will already know, has been a pioneering figure in the development of Southern criminology. He is the editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Criminology in the Global South, and more recently, an edited book on prisons, inmates and governance in Latin America. Today he's going to talk about the persistent punitive turn in Latin America, and it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you everybody for coming. It's really, I am really happy to be here today and to present these ideas around penal trends in Latin America. So as you know, my first language is not English, so I will try to do my best. But if you think that something could not be understood, you please just say it, and I will try to go back and correct it. So, as you know, the notion of the punitive term has been well diffused as a key in how to think about penal change in contemporary societies, particularly in punishment and society studies in the global north since the 1990s. And in the construction of this expression, the case of the US was really important because it has been an extreme and early case of this kind of penal development, not only around incarceration rates, but also around other kinds of indicators of increasing penal expansion and intensification. Of course, punitive term is connected with the growth of punitiveness, but the notion of punitiveness itself has a lot of different kind of possibilities in terms of definition. So there is a notion of punitiveness that has been well diffused that interprets punitiveness as some sort of abuse or excess. But I prefer more to think about punitiveness as the levels of human pain or suffering produced by penalty, inspired by the old work of Niels Christie in the 1980s. Of course, there are very many difficulties in building empirical indicators about punitiveness, both about the dimension of extension and about the dimension of intensity of penalty. And we all know that the incarceration rate has a lot of limits, but I will use it mainly throughout this presentation today. And we could come back to these limits, particularly in the case of Latin America. And there is in all this debate the complex question of magnitude. How much punitiveness has to grow in order to think about in terms of punitive term. So, for example, the comparison between England and Wales and the USA is very interesting. Throughout these 4 decades, 1970s, 2010s, in the USA, the growth was of 350% in the incarceration rate, but in England and Wales was of 91%. And I always remember this quotation of Frank Simrin by David Downs, that there is always the risk of comparing a haircut with a beheading, that I think is a very interesting thing. So in punishment and society in the global north, since the 1990s, there were different interpretative frameworks in order to understand punitive term and other phenomena connected with the penal realm. So we can briefly signal 3 that has been very important in the debate, and also very important in the debate about the punitive term in Latin America, the late modern penalty thesis that is associated mainly with the work of David Garland, and the neoliberal penalty thesis that is mainly associated with the work of Loic Paquin, and then another thesis that probably was not so much debated in the English-speaking countries as in continental Europe and Latin America, the post-Fordist penalty thesis that I will associate with the work of Alessandro De Giorgi mainly. These 3 different thesis that I assume that you all know more or less have many, many differences in how they interpret the punitive term. But I think that beyond these many differences, they share three interrelated characteristics. First, the identification of the sources of the punitive term in deep or background causes that are thought in different ways, but always as structural, macroscopic processes, late modernity, neoliberalism, post-Fordism. In their less cautious versions, these different deep or background causes are elevated to the status of an epochal change. Second, there is a certain obsession with change in these three theses, so that deviates attention from inertia and constructs simplified visions of the past. In the less cautious versions, the past is vanished or is about to vanish in our present, and it could even be considered with a nostalgic attitude. And third, the engines of the punitive term identified by these different interpretative frameworks, late modernity, neoliberalism, post-Fordism, are by definition destined to cross borders. As a consequence, in their less cautious versions, the authors extended their arguments not only to other contexts of the global north, but even to the global south. But since the 1990s also, and particularly in the last decade, there are also other contributions in punishment and society studies, particularly in English-speaking countries, that have in some way challenged these narratives, these theses, and have presented a critical view around these 3 points that I have already marked. By one side, there are different case studies and comparative studies at state level inside the USA that imply a detailed reconstruction of historical processes and by other side, comparative studies across national contexts of the global north that highlighted the identification and explanation of penal differences. We can think of particularly of the work by Cavandino and Dignam, Lacey, or Lapi Sepala in the last years. So these other sources has produced, from my perspective, 3 displacements that I think are very, very important in theoretical terms. First, they have highlighted the way the proximate causes of penal change, from electoral systems to penal ideologies, from struggles between politician and administrator around penal decisions to the role of single issue groups. Second, they have in some way elaborated around the persistence of the penal past in the penal present. So we have all the debate about path dependence, but also more recently, the metaphor of palimpsest in order to think about contemporary penalty. And third, they have presented images of contemporary penalty beyond penal convergence and the globalization of the penal term. And I think that this last is a very, very important thing because it has connected with developments in recent times in different places of the world. We had cases of interruption of punitive growth or even punitive decline in the 2000s in the East. And this trend has consolidated in many national cases and expanded towards the West during the last decade. And now we have, a growing literature in punishment and society studies internationally around this, around stability or reduction of the levels of punitiveness. So if we go rapidly, these are data of the changes in incarceration rates in different regions of the world between 2010 and 2022 or 23, depending on the last data available. So here, for example, we have countries that belong to the Soviet Union. So as you can see, the decrease of incarceration rates is quite astonishing in the last years. This is Eastern Europe. This is Central European countries. This is Nordic countries. This is Southern European countries. The main case here is the example of Spain. And here are the English-speaking countries, where you can see some very important decreases of the incarceration rate in Canada, USA, or New Zealand in the last 10 years or so. But when we come to Latin American countries, we find this. So there is a huge contrast. As you can see, here we have 18 countries of Latin America. We didn't include some countries like Cuba, Haiti, because we don't have data available for the last years. And as you can see, there is a huge growth in the incarceration rate in the last 10 years or so in many of these countries, with the exceptions of Chile, Mexico, Dominican Republic, and Colombia. If we are lucky, I could go back to these exceptions at the end of the talk. So if we compare the incarceration rates of Latin American countries today with the one 30 years ago, at the beginning of the 1990s, the change is really, really astonishing. In some cases, it's of course extraordinary, crazy, as in the case of El Salvador, that is now our champion of mass incarceration in Latin America, as many of you know. Here we can see it through the percentages of growth in incarceration rates. So another thing that we can say very rapidly, that there is a common trend, but with some important variations. From these extreme cases, like El Salvador, 170% of increase in incarceration rate in the last 3 decades, to the Dominican Republic with 56%, or Mexico with 60%. There is a huge difference. But 12 out of 18 countries at least duplicated its incarceration rates in 30 years, and 10 triplicated it in the same period. And this has produced, of course, dramatic effects both inside and outside the walls of prisons in terms of overcrowding, the dramatic deterioration of prison conditions, social stigmatization and exclusion of entire communities, etc. So there are huge and interesting questions around this variation for a comparative perspective that, if I am lucky, I could come back at the end of my presentation. So these changes in Latin America has produced a recent but increasing literature trying to understand these changes in the penal field in the Latin American countries, and particularly since the 2000s. The 2000s is the date in which these efforts began to spread in Latin American social sciences. And in all these first efforts, there was a huge attraction of the intellectual production on the punitive front in the global north, and particularly in relation to the USA. That is connected with multiple reasons. First, there were comparable harsh penal trends in many national cases. Second, there were actual importation of crime control discourses and practices from the US into Latin American countries. And third, there is this traditional dependency and subordination in the production of knowledge on the criminal question, on crime and punishment, between the global north and the south. So these 3 theses that I presented before, the thesis of late modern penality, the thesis of neoliberal penalty, and the thesis of post-Fordist penalty, were being used by many authors in order to understand changes in penalty, the increasing level of punitiveness, in both, in some cases, focused on single national cases like Brazil or Argentina or Chile, and in more ambitious attempts about the whole region. And in these uses, in some occasions, the analysis produced were connected only to one of these interpretative frameworks, but in others, there were some sort of combinations between them, because there were, in these different perspectives, spaces of intersection already present in the work of the Global North authors. So in the last years emerged a more recent critical position about this kind of reading, about these processes of theoretical importation, in dialogue with detailed explorations of historical processes in some, few, I have to say, very few, Latin American context, and the first attempts to build comparative perspectives across them, but also in connection with the theoretical discussions in the global north, in punishment and society in the global north, that I have very briefly mentioned, both comparative studies across the global north and case studies and comparative studies at a state level in the USA. So from these 2 sources, a more critical position about these translation processes of these 3 theses has been emerging. And in this new literature, the need to go beyond these theses under 3 common interrelated characteristics was highlighted quite clearly. So this means being against overgeneralization, the in-depth exploration of the US case and other contexts of the global north has produced invaluable tools to think about the punitive term, but they have to be provincialized, situated in certain temporal and spatial coordinates. This implies not treating the concepts and arguments as universal, but rather restoring what we might define as their embeddedness, using a very interesting concept of Dario Melosi 20 years ago, in specific spatial and temporal coordinates. Suspending the taking for granted universality implies opening the possibility of affirming its uselessness for other peripheral or even central places or time. In a way, these theses these readings about the punitive turn in the global north become indispensable, but at the same time inadequate to understand penal trends in peripheral countries. That is quite a paradox. But at the same time, in these most recent attempts, happens a lot, something that a colleague from Scotland, Louise Brangan, has highlighted recently, that in many cases, these critical approaches towards dominant narratives in central context that were produced in peripheral context finish in some sort of deficit theorization, in defining through negation, only identifying absences. For example, we in Latin America don't have a penal welfare complex in the 20th century because we didn't have welfare states in comparison with the ones in the global north and so on and so forth. So I think that this is a very, very important point, the point made by Luis in this recent text. And I found that in many of these debates in the last years in Latin America, in these critical positions, we can see exactly this, arriving to the point of defining absences or defining negations, but not elaborating alternative explanation. And I feel myself, in a way, my recent scholarship in this area also, in some way, being guilty of this kind of topic, but probably it's a necessary step. But the challenge is to go beyond it. And I will try to do this in relation to, in this second part of my talk today, in relation to the exploration of the case of Argentina. I have been trying for the last 10 years to do this, an in-depth, thick reconstruction of empirical processes from the transition to the democracy to the present, in an attempt to build a historical sociology of penal change, but also dialoguing with recent work that has been produced in other countries of Latin America, like Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Venezuela. So I will present in this part of my talk a tentative balance of this attempt to explain the punitive term in Argentina, trying to highlight three interrelated layers that need to be combined in order to understand what has happened in the penal field in this country in the last 40 years. And after doing this, I will try to come back to a comparative perspective. So this is the evolution of incarceration rate in the last 50 years in Latin America, including the 1970s. As many of you know, during the 1960s and 70s, Argentina had experienced very dramatic military dictatorships that has produced a huge amount of human rights violations. And the transition to democracy started in 1983. This 90 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants in 1983. We don't have data for the entire country since 1983 till 1995. And from there, from there, without touching it, you can see the very important growth that has been produced. So I mentioned that I think that we have to put into relation three layers in order to understand this punitive term in this country. So the first one is connected with the transformations of capitalism and the pendulum between neoliberalism and post-neoliberalism and economic and social changes. As you all know, the transformations in the capitalist regimes of production of accumulation at the global level has been translated in different contexts of the world in the production of a neoliberal term, but a neoliberal term that has had a lot of variations across the globe, but also inside Latin America. So in the case of Argentina, the two first waves of neoliberal economic and social policies has been produced during the last dictatorship, 1976, 1983, and during the decade between 1989 and 2001, there was a mistake there, in the experience of what we call Menemism, the political alliance after the name of a president, President Menem, who has produced the main part of the neoliberal term in Argentina during the 1990s, with the usual combination, but in an extreme manner, of deregulation, privatization, and the industrialization that has been translated in a huge expansion of social inequality, poverty, and unemployment during the 1990s, but particularly during the 1990s. This has been in some way marked by two extreme crises. economic, social, and political crisis, the crisis of 1999 and the crisis of 2001. In 2001, we had 5 presidents in 1 week. That is a Guinness record, in a way. But what is interesting is that during the 1980s, the levels of punitiveness measured through the imperfect indicator of the incarceration rate didn't grow. They were just decline. No, if we compare the beginning of the first democratic government, 1983, with 1992, there was a 31% decline of the incarceration rate. This has changed completely in the 1990s. So between 1992 and 2002, at the peak of the second very important economic, social, and political crisis, there was a 98% of growth of the incarceration rate. But after this very important crisis, this huge crisis, in Argentina, as in many other Latin American countries, and we could go back to this in the Q&A, in Argentina has been produced a huge political change with the ascendance of a post-neoliberal political alliance that we also label in relation to the name of the president at that time, Kirchnerism. This new political alliance has governed the country between 2003 and 2015 and has produced important changes in terms of economic and social policies that has been translated in the decrease of social inequality and the growth of social expenditure, particularly during the 2000s. So if we take, for example, the Gini index of 2002 was 0.498, and in 2015 was 0.392. Of course, a very high Gini index if we compare it with the countries of Europe, but still a very, very low one in comparison with the other countries of Latin America, with a huge decrease across 13 years. And there were also very important decreases in the levels of poverty and unemployment, particularly until the beginning of the 2010s. But this was combined with the continuous growth of the incarceration rate as a not so important degree, with a 37% between the 2002 and 2015. There are ways of understanding this from this kind of macroscopic perspective, thinking about transformations of capitalism, that is connected with emphasizing the limits of the reversal of the economic and social trends of the previous decades during the neoliberal decades, as we call it, the 1970s and the 1990s, and the subsistence of what has been called in social sciences, by many social scientists in Latin America during the 2000s, the marginal pole, a pole of the population to which the betterment in terms of the economy and society during the 2000s didn't arrive. So in a way, the reduction of inequality didn't produce a betterment of their living conditions during the 2000s. And of course, this marginal pole has been and continue to be the privileged target of processes of criminalization. So there are some people who think that we can understand the continuous growth of the incarceration rate despite the decline of social inequality and the increase of welfare expenditure through this way of thinking. But I think that in order to understand this better, we need another layer that is not connected with these transformations of capitalism. But last slide on this layer. After this, there was a huge crisis of this post-neoliberal political alliance, a new right government that governed between 2015 and 2019, that has in some way restored neoliberal policies. And in that moment, there was also the beginning of a new economic crisis that is our present crisis. So we have our third very, very strong crisis that is a crisis of inflation, with a huge increase in the levels of poverty and unemployment, and also with the interruption of the reduction of the levels of inequality. During this last period, there was another huge increase of incarceration rates, 33% in only 4 years. So in these last 4 years, between 2015 and 2019, the incarceration rate grew at exactly the same level, or at exactly the same amount as in the entire post-neoliberal period. But I think that in order to understand what has happened with penalty in Argentina in the last 40 years, this layer is a very important one, but we cannot stop our explanation there. So I think that we have to put together with this first layer, a second layer around the politicization of crime and punishment and the struggles around penal policy. As I have already said, during the 1980s, in the period of the beginning of the transition to democracy, there was not only a stability of the indicators of punitiveness, but even a decline of it. And to explain this first period that lasted for more than a decade, it's very interesting to understand how first crime, street crime, was not at the center of the political and public debate in the 1980s because other topics were there, the promises of democratization, the changes after the long night of the dictatorships. Crimes of the state produced during the dictatorship occupied a very, very important space in the public and political debate. But also the first democratic government produced a discourse around crime and punishment that could be labeled as liberal, not neoliberal. I mean liberal in terms of the 18th century. And they have been able to construct a consensus with the political opposition that has been translated in several legal changes during the first years of the 1980s that has produced both practical and symbolic effects that in a great measure explain the reduction in the levels of incarceration rates. This has changed only in the second half of the 1990s, after the first stage of the neoliberal reforms, when this political alliance connected with neoliberalism, Menemism, entered into a crisis of legitimacy in the second half of the 1990s, and they produce a language of mano dura, of hard hand, clearly as an answer to this situation of crisis of legitimacy, in some way connected with the long tradition of authoritarianism in Argentina, so restoring some meanings and images in the public and political debate that belong to the long history of the authoritarian tradition in Argentina. They built what I have been called a punitive populist wave from above, because it was clearly connected with the elites. And in doing this, they have built another kind of consensus, exactly the opposite as the one at the beginning of the transition to democracy, a punitive consensus that has been translated in legal and policy changes at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. This has been connected also at the beginning of the 2000s with the first examples of social movements around the image of the victim that have produced huge, important demands of increasing punitiveness in the country. So after the first wave of punitive populism from above, it occurred in Argentina another wave of punitive populism from below that has also been very effective in producing legal and policy changes. And in this sense, after the ascendance of Kirchnerism in 2003, we can witness a more ambivalent relation of this political alliance with the penal realm in general that is connected with the heterogeneity of this political alliance, of this government, with different sectors that have different discourses around crime and punishment, and has also been connected with moments of political weakness and political strength. And I think that's a very interesting element in the Argentinian case during those years. In moments of political strength of this post-neoliberal political alliance, we can see a marginalization of crime and punishment from the political and public agenda because other topics were at the center of it. For example, the nationalization of previously privatized companies of public services. And we can see also in the main actors of this political alliance, a progressive rhetoric. And this alliance won general elections like the one in 2007 and 2011 with this kind of a strategy without talking about crime and punishment, and when saying something about it, using a progressive rhetoric. Also, a very interesting point here is the impact of the human rights movement in this moment in Argentina inside this political alliance. Argentina is characterized as a country in Latin America that has experienced the transition to democracy with a very, very strong human rights movement that has played very important roles in many different situations. And in this juncture has played a very, very important role in some way molding the governmental discourse of this political alliance and producing some limited legal and policy changes toward penal moderation that have impacted effectively in the incarceration rate, particularly between 2005 and 2011. As you can see there was a stability in the level of the incarceration rate. But in moments of political weakness, the punitive temptation also appeared inside the actors of this political alliance. And this has been seen clearly in the last moment of this political alliance in government between 2003 and 2005. When the new right government arrived in 2016, they have produced a new wave of punitive populism. There has been a clear return to the language of mano dura and many different legal and policy changes in this direction. So I think that this second layer is also very important in order to understand what has been the main transformations of penalty in Argentina during these 4 decades. But I think that we need to add a third layer that is connected with institutional conditions and dynamics, particularly in relation to the penal system. First, police, judicial, and prison bureaucracies in Argentina have high levels of permeability in relation to politics, but also to some extent in relation to public opinion and the electorate. There is a strong politicization of the nomination of their authorities, even in the judicial branch. The process of nomination and removal of judges in Argentina is highly politicized, has always been like this, and has been increasingly like this during the transition to democracy until the present. I will come back to this if I can. So penal actors, police actors, judicial actors, prison actors constantly read changes in government and political climates in relation to crime and punishment and accommodate their discourses and practices in relation to these changes. There is a very interesting example of the changes in the statistical indicators of sentencing in Argentina that I didn't bring here because there was too much information, but it's fantastic to see how the number of convictions, the types of conviction, and the severity of conviction changes with the waves of penal politics in Argentina very clearly. And I think it's an empirical evidence of this strong connection with politics and the permeability of these penal bureaucracies. So during the transition to democracy in Argentina, as in many other Latin American countries, emerged a strong movement of criminal justice reform in the name of the rule of law, in the name of democracy, trying to build a transition from an inquisitorial model of criminal justice to an adversarial model. But this process of reform that started in Argentina in the 1980s, in the beginning of the transition to democracy, has mutated strongly in the 1990s because there was a huge introduction, an important introduction of a managerial discourse inside these criminal justice reforms, the language of efficiency and effectiveness and its affinity with a neoliberal ethos become to be widespread in the processes of criminal justice reform. One important thing that I didn't say before is that Argentina is a federal state and we have 24 different criminal justice systems. So it's a very complex context and the subnational variation is immense, it's really, really big. But we can see this all over the 24 jurisdictions. And we can see it also in the central role of the expansion of mechanisms of conviction without trial, some sort of translation of the American plea bargaining that has played a very important role since the 1990s in all these jurisdictions in changing criminal justice. But also during the waves of punitive populism, there were also some counter reforms to these reforms of the criminal justice. So, for example, the expansion of prison on remand, changing the laws governing prison on remand was very, very important in the different waves of punitive populism, in the 3 ones, at the mid-1990s, at the beginning of the 2000s, and at the end of the 2010s. There were changes in the rules around prison on remand in different jurisdictions, expanding the use of prison on remand against the original idea of the criminal justice reform process that were restricting the uses of prison on remand. And in general, these processes of reform has produced a strong public investment in relation to the criminal justice that has produced a massive increase of its capacity. And another important thing is that the continuous persistence of conservative judicial actors, prosecutors, and judges since the transition to democracy. In the beginning of the transition to democracy in Argentina, as in many other countries that has experienced a transition from authoritarian regime, there was the important public discussion about what we could do with the judicial branch. Now we need to replace all judges that have been operating during the dictatorship and in some way have been accomplices of the crimes of the state during that period. The answer, the political answer at the beginning of the transition to democracy in Argentina was only a partial replacement. That was why there was a very important group of conservative judicial actors all in the old 1980s and 1990s. But also there were then, in a very politicized process of nomination of judges and prosecutors, the impact of the partial renewal of judicial actors during the new right governments that has produced constant struggles in the judicial field that are very, very interesting around the direction of penal decisions. We can say something that is quite similar in relation to the police forces, and I will try to be brief because I'm running out of time, I think. Yes. No, I still have 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
So
No, have 10.
10. That's fine.
10, have 10.
I have 10. So the transition to democracy has also been combined with the absolute absence of reforms of the police institutions in Argentina. We have 27 police institutions, 4 federal police forces, 23 provincial police forces. This has implied a strong persistence of authoritarian rationalities and practices. For example, the extended use or an abusive use of force. And also police institutions has always been very strongly politicized. Again, the nomination of police authorities is connected with the changes of government. But we don't have to interpret this politicization as dependency from governmental authorities, elected governmental authorities. So there is a very interesting case in this direction that was the role of the federal police forces lobby during Menemism in the construction of the language of mano dura. So in a way, the language of mano dura in Argentina in the 1990s was an invention of police actors first, that then has been translated into political and public life through politicians of that government. There were some partial processes of reform of some provincial police forces at the end of the 1990s and in the federal police forces in the second half of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s. But these were very ambitious processes of reform with promises around democratization of the police services with very limited outcomes that have also been followed by counter reforms. Counter reforms that in many occasions has been produced inside the so-called progressive governments. So there has been a constant pendulum of police politics in Argentina. But beyond this pendulum, what we can see is a huge public investment in police that has been translated not only in the number of police officers, but in the resources of the police forces all over Argentina. And finally, we can tell a very similar story around prison services with the absence of processes of reform, with some legal changes that have been strongly similar to the legal text of the past, and with some level of public investment in prison facilities, in prison buildings since the 1990s, the mid-1990s, that has produced in some context, I think that we could not say this for all the country, the increased capacity of prison services, however, with constant extreme overpopulation throughout these years. So I think that we need to introduce this layer in order to think about other dimension that is connected with institutional conditions and dynamics that has been also very important in order to understand the punitive term in Argentina. So we need to think through these 3 layers in order to make sense of it. So this multi-layered explanation, of course, is built on a case study. And I always remember this very interesting sentence by Nicola Lacey. She said that the risk is to become mesmerized by the fascinating details of local peculiarity. And it's a risk that I myself has been in some way in it all the time, and probably also in this part of my talk. I think that, the peculiarities are really, really important if we want to understand something that is going on with the penal field. But there is this problem of finishing our task there in some sort of peculiar narrative around a single case. So I think that we need to multiply these specific narratives on different national jurisdictions and try to, as she said, aggregate upward and across jurisdictions. So I will try to end to present in this last part of my talk what I think are some ideas for a comparative perspective around the punitive term in Latin America today. And I will not make the examples of the different national cases. We can leave this for the Q&A. I think that we need to strongly articulate the macro, meso, and micro level. The macroscopic economic and social conditions and dynamics are conditions, but not determinants of penal change. So we need to give centrality to what David Garland mentioned a decade ago as the proximate causes, nominated as the proximate causes. Although I don't like so much the idea of cause, but I like a lot the idea of proximity. Some years before, Pat O'Malley used the metaphor of the transmission belt, but I really like it, or the translation processes, how these macroscopic processes translate into penal policy on penal decisions, penal outcomes. And I think that to understand this transmission belt politics is central, but of course, thought in a broad sense and beyond any kind of voluntarist vision about politics. And in doing this, as Joshua Page, Michel Phelps, and Philip Goodman have emphasized in his very interesting book, I think it is key to think about the struggles around the power to punishment and build these narratives that are actor-centered, agonistic, in which politicians play a role, of course, but also social movements like human rights, victim movements, women movements, and judicial police and prison actors. All these actors have different and unequal type of forces. And we have to think about bottom-up dynamics for and against the punitive trends, but also we have to be careful because the elites continue to play in a country like Argentina a crucial role. And we have also to think about intra-elite conflict. That is a very important dimension. We have to identify dominant trends, but also the constant challenges and contestations to these dominant trends. Even in many situations, they are very, very difficult because it's not the same to follow than to confront the wave, as everybody knows from swimming. So the significance of political and penal rationalities and programs, I think, has to be highlighted, but without freezing political rationalities and programs in a moment in time and in space. So neoliberalism is not one thing, it's something that changes and hybridizes across time and space. So we need to think about the importance of political and public climates around crime and punishment and the warming, cooling metaphors, to use the metaphors that Ian and Richard has presented in this book a decade ago or so. And also the complex and mediated connection to crime trends. I didn't mention crime trends till this point, so I am very happy to come back to this because I know that it could be a concern. And we have to think about real democracy and the dynamics of political adventure, junctures, weaknesses and strengths of governmental alliances. I think that for the case of Argentina, this is crucial in understanding the variable place of crime, the political and public agenda, in relation with other tensions and problems. And we also have to think about governmental alliances, their heterogeneity, their increasing heterogeneity in our countries, and the fragilization and reconfiguration of political identities. As many of you know, we have now an ultra-neoliberal right, an ultra-neoliberal far right and I could not add more adjectives because I don't know it in English, President, that it's a big product of this fragilization and reconfiguration of political identity. We also have to take into consideration institutional features, thinking that they are conditions but not determinants, and always in relation to the outcomes of the ongoing struggles. So I think levels of autonomy of penal institutions from political struggles is very, very important, as I have to show, I try to show in my third layer. And I think that we have to think clearly on the centrality of the legacies of the past, particularly in context like Argentina with a very strong authoritarian tradition. There is a very interesting concept built by a Brazilian sociologist that was the socially implanted authoritarianism, a very long-standing tradition of thought, not only around politics, but also in everyday life. And the partial and limited reforms of penal bureaucracies has a lot to say in connection with this persistence of authoritarian ways of thinking and acting. And finally, we have to think about growing state capacity, because our penal state, to use the expression of the government, has been growing without force in the last 40 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, we have plenty of time available for comments, questions, discussion, so the floor is open. Yeah.
All right. While people are thinking.
While people are thinking.
While people are thinking. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. It made me laugh actually, because you said something. You apologized for your English at the beginning, but you used at least 4 words that I don't know. You can tell us.
Probably because it doesn't exist.
But your vocabulary is.
You Latinized English.
Yeah, but, well, no, I'm sure not. I'm sure not. It reflects badly on me. Your talk also made, I mean, it didn't only make me laugh, it made me think a lot. It's really good, but it also made me laugh when you made a reference to only defining absences, because Nikki Lacey and I in the early 90s spent 3 years interviewing German police officers about the role of community in policing, and then had to write an article on community in German criminal justice, a significant absence, because we'd made the absolute category error of not first inquiring before we even began the research on the relevance of community at that point in German policing history. But I did wonder whether maybe I'm just trying to recover my self-esteem, but or respond to your point about absences, which is that what looks like a failure or an error of judgment or understanding. One could say that it's perhaps like a necessary first step to actually establishing the limits of the usefulness of a criminology developed in the global north, in your case, in its applicability to Latin America. And I know that other Latin American criminal law and criminological scholars have worried about the tension between joining a global conversation using language developed primarily in the global north with a different impulse, which is to recognize its limits and its limited applicability to your own country. So I just wondered whether you share that tension, whether, because you've used a lot of the language and the writings, as everybody necessarily perhaps does, derived from America, the Anglophone global north, basically. So.
Can I answer? Yeah, fascinating topic and a very difficult one. I think that I can answer it using my own biography in relation to these kind of studies. So when I started to think about these themes at the end of the 2000s, I found The Culture of Control by David Garland. I translated it into Spanish. So as many other things in relation to these debates. And I was thinking this is a very important book in order to understand what is going on, and try to, in some way, to build my own understanding of what was going on in that moment in Argentina, using this frame of reference. So it was like trying to find evidence that could connect with the late modern penalty thesis. And today I found this exercise very, let's say, unsatisfying, of course, because at the end of the day, you all the time finish yourself in identifying these absences, these negations, and without producing an alternative explanation of what is going on. But I have been discussing this with Luis Brangan recently, and I know that Luis came here last time. Yeah. So because I think definitely it is a first step when you are working in a context, because this is a very important thing. We have been talking quite a lot, not in this talk, but in other of my stuff about inequalities in knowledge production around the criminal question globally and so on and so forth. We don't have to forget that inequality is translated into, very few resources to do research, less amount of people doing research, less amount of intellectual production around different topics in those countries. So in that moment, when we didn't have a lot of local authors writing about it, it was a very important, let's say, way of promoting this type of research. And I think that probably it is a necessary first step, because you have to deal with these categories, with concepts. The thing is how we do this without stopping there, without stopping in the level of negation, saying, well, community is absent as an idea in policies around police or security in Germany or around criminal justice. And so I think that is a challenge. It's really a challenge. And I think that to do this, we can learn a lot also from the North. I mean, that's why I think that all these two strands of literature, both case studies at the state level in the USA, I am thinking on many different authors, but particularly on the work by Philip Goodman and Joshua Page. But I also these comparative works at the end of the 2000s, trying to build, to in some way break with the idea of penal convergence, like the work by Cavandina and Dignam or Lacey. I think that give us also many insights in order to go back to our cases and to rethink what we were doing in relation to understanding this. But I think it is a first step. The thing is how we can not end ourselves in that trap, and saying just this is what I have to say, and I think that there are in this recent literature that has a more critical relation with these grand narratives that were dominant in some moment in punishment and society studies, particularly in the 2000s in the global North, that there are different insights that could give us cues in order to understand this. For example, around state capacity, so we have several authors that, like David Fonseca or Luis here, Dal Santo, talking about Brazil, that have in some way tried to develop this argument in order to understand better that beyond, let's say, the political debate, political actors, political rationalities and programs, there are other things that are going on behind the scenes. In this case, in many cases, in the name of democracy and the rule of law. So the first public investments in these institutions in some national context, like in criminal justice in Argentina, was definitely the case, were in the name of producing a criminal justice that was finally respectful of the principles of the rule of law. But you have produced a huge increase in the levels of prosecutors and courts that in another moment, with another kind of languages, with another kind of climate, has produced an increasing level of confidence. So it's a paradoxical effect. And I think that this is interesting. And we can see this also, in my case, I read it after reading about this argument in Argentina, in Latin America, sorry. We can see arguments like this, for example, in Heather Schoenfeld's book around Florida, where she said, well, prison litigation movement and the concern about human rights in the 60s in Florida has produced some unintended consequences in terms of state capacity. And I think, oh, that's interesting. So I don't know if I am, I don't have a, I am not confident that we finally arrived to that point, but I think that we have to move in this direction. And it's of course difficult. And the way to do it is, at least from my perspective, is this kind of in-depth, thick reconstruction of our own empirical processes that in some ways difficult to do because it's time consuming. And also it's many times difficult to present, particularly for audiences that are not connected particularly with these histories. But as I always said, you know, I know quite well the political history of California, you know, and that is because I have read so many texts about penal transformations in California. So other people could read things about Argentina.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. So bearing in mind that, you know, concepts and ideas can take place very differently in all in Argentina and Latin America. Is there a similar dynamic of punching down, of constructing a dangerous class, of criminalizing marginalized groups in Latin America and Argentina? And then as that changed, you know, throughout history, modern history, have you seen that take on in life as sort of a sediment or as a relic of past systems of penality in the present, particularly with mind to, you know, popular perceptions of penality?
Very interesting thing, very interesting topic. I mean, if we think that beyond the many differences between the national contexts, we share common history. We share 500 years of colonialism and imperialism, both by the Spanish and the Portuguese kingdoms. And as you know, many of Latin American social theorists in the last 10, 15 years have, in the context of what has been labeled the decolonial term, has built some categories in order to think the persistence of some of these elements of the colonial past in our present, like the concept of a colonial matrix of power by Aníbal Quijano, that in some way present the idea that the social hierarchies that were produced during the colonial times, that were completely crossed through racialization, have in some way persisted through the 200 years of independent nation states in Latin America, and has produced and continue to produce a huge number of effects. One could be considered our, let's say, native concept in critical criminological discourses in Latin America of the 1970s, selectivity of the penal systems. We usually use this expression in order to think about this focus on marginalized people, on the of marginalized people of the penal system, both of the police and the criminal justice and the prisons. And I think that this is a very important idea today, or also to think about our penal systems. This idea of the concentration, I don't know if it works well in English, but this idea of the focalization of the criminal justice system on marginal people, of this marginal fold that I referred before. I think it's a very interesting key in order to understand what is going on with penal systems. But after saying that, I think it's a very important thing, and I agree with thinking about these colonial legacies, and this is other part of my work recently. At the same time, I don't think that you can understand a huge change through inertia or persistence. And this has been a huge change. So, I mean, selectivity could be considered a constant thing and could be understood as a consequence of inertia. But I don't think that the punitive time could be considered only, you know, the effect of the legacies of colonialism today, because in the Because at the beginning of the 1990s, we had Nordic incarceration rates. So the level of incarceration of our countries was more or less similar to the Scandinavian countries. And of course, life in prison was not exactly the same thing. But in terms of the expansion of the penal systems, the number of people in prison in Argentina was the same as in Sweden. So when we think that this has triplicated in the last 40 years, I don't think that we can appeal to colonial legacies in order to understand this, or at least not as a main argument.
One small point that you mentioned, I know in the studies you mentioned about the prison capacity and its effect on punitiveness. But I must say I never understood it even in the realm of the US, where most of these studies were conducted, and you mentioned it here with regard to Argentina. What's the mechanism? I mean, do judges think, oh, now there's more space in prison, so let's give him 5 years instead of 3? I mean, how does it work that prison capacity affects the number of prisoners?
Fantastic point, and I completely agree with your question. It was exactly my first question when I first encountered this argument at the beginning of the 2010s in the work of another colleague and friend, Paul Hadhasi, in relation to Argentina and Chile. It was exactly my question, And I think that there is a problem in some versions of this argument that imagine that the state capacity is something that is constructed by itself behind the scenes. And state capacity is connected with budgets, and budgets are a key decision of politics. And are hotly debated inside legislatures, inside political alliances. So I think that are always connected with the outcomes of the political struggles. So if you, in a moment, have a government like the Argentinian first democratic government that decided, let's transform the criminal justice system, the federal criminal justice system, towards an adversarial model, because it would be respectful of the principles of the rule of law. And after all the human rights violations of the last dictatorship, we need another type of criminal justice. And they have put with this political decision money on the process of reform. So this orientation has also in some way produce results or effects in how this state capacity is built and what for. I don't think that, it's that this state capacity has been translated immediately in producing more criminal cases, sanctioning with prison sentences more people. I don't think it was the case. And in fact, it was not the case if we look at the statistics that we have. The number of sentences during the beginning of the 1990s in Argentina were going down, not going up. And the severity of the prison sentences were going down, not going up. So, I mean, state capacity could be combined with other elements and produce not exactly the result of more punitiveness. But the problem is when this state capacity was already built, and you have these waves of increasing punitiveness, both from politics and in the public and political debate. And you also have the replacement, the partial replacement of the actors of the criminal justice system, including hundreds of more conservative prosecutors and judges. You begin to see the increase in the severity of sentences and in the amount and the quantity of sentences to prison. So I think that we need to combine the argument about state capacity with this other layer. We cannot think that it's a layer independently operating by itself. I think that it is strongly connected with this. There is a very interesting debate about criminal justice reform in Latin America, not only in Argentina, between the reformers themselves, because many of the people that play a very important role in reforming criminal justice systems in Latin America are liberal people that came from this tradition of the 1980s in the transition to democracy. And when we discuss today how the principles of efficiency and efficacy and the neoliberal ethos have in some way been introduced and with a huge weight in the processes of reform, they said, well, we want also an efficient criminal justice system, but we want an efficient criminal justice system that do not produce huge level of prison sentences, that produce other ways of solving conflicts between people that are criminalized. And we think that this is possible. And we have always been fighting for these alternatives to imprisonment. So the problem is not the notion of efficiency in itself, it's efficiency to do what, to arrive to what outcome. And I think it's interesting in a way, because it's part of how the political struggles also enter into the institutional dimension. So I agree with you that we have to be careful on how we build this idea of state capacity, and how this state capacity is connected with the other processes. That's why I think of this multi-layered explanation of a set of interrelated dynamics, and not, with a single one that could be considered the main or the most important one, guiding the other things through the process.
On this kind of idea of state capacity, you had mentioned sort of this human rights centrality in Argentina, especially between kind of 2005, 2011, and this kind of idea that this was sort of keeping down certain rates, or at least stabilizing incarceration rates, and that obviously there's been a change in kind of this present context. And so I'm just thinking about this ongoing conversation around kind of the utility of human rights law, for example, and whether or not we can actually use things like international human rights and human rights treatises and things of that nature to exact actual change. And I was just curious, in this kind of present punitive context, is there a capacity to employ those same kind of mechanisms, those, whether you call them liberal mechanisms or the idea of human rights, or kind of to use a very politicized court system or legal system to exact change? Or are we has it gotten to such a point, has the rate increased to such a degree now that this kind of human rights rhetoric, this human rights legality of a decade ago, is there a place for it anymore, or has it kind of found itself rendered obsolete because of this turn of a new right government? And what role do kind of those structures play now?
Very interesting point. Thank you very much. In the case of Argentina, I think that the connection between the penal realm and human rights movement is very, very important. First, because we began our transition to democracy with very strong demand by human rights movement to prosecute and punish crimes of the state during the dictatorship. And for us, it was really a defining feature of the transition to democracy. And in fact, it's something that really distinguished the Argentinian case from the other South American cases. And this trend towards punishing crimes against humanity during the dictatorship has been stopped by different measures, legal and political measures, at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, in this moment of crisis that I mentioned, that was really a crazy moment of hyperinflation in Argentina and a strong widespread weakness of the political system, and so on and so forth. So in this very critical moment, this has been stopped. But with the post-neoliberal political alliance in 2003, all these criminal proceedings have restarted. And now we have 1,100 prisoners in prisons that are sentenced because of crimes of the state during the 1970s. And there is a huge movement around these courts, trials, proceedings, a very important one. So in the 2003, 4, 5, exactly when this post-neoliberal alliance was producing many decisions towards making this possible, many of the actors of the human rights movement began to have positions inside the governments, both in provincial governments and in federal governments, and began to have influence in the rhetoric, in the official rhetoric of the political alliance. And I think that this was a very, very interesting moment in which this influence, among other things, have produced this stability in the levels of punitiveness. And in fact, there were some particular decisions that were inspired by these actors that you can follow perfectly well. So there is a very interesting case in the Supreme Court of Justice at the federal level around overcrowding in prisons in the Buenos Aires province in 2005-6 that have produced very interesting decisions that in fact have led to change of legal texts at the provincial level, particularly on prison on remand, in a more progressive way. So I think that these things has operated and happened. And there is another thing that we didn't talk about it because it's impossible to do, but life inside prisons in Argentina could be very, very hard because of the levels of overcrowding, because of the poor living conditions, because of the traditional uses of violence by prison services, and so on and so forth. So human rights movements have been very active in relation to prison life in Argentina. So now we have, for example, a new institution that was built in 2017, and here in the UK, you also have this in England and Wales, in Scotland. There is the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture. So there is a mechanism for the prevention of torture that was the consequence of the international treaty signed by many nations. But in the case of Argentina, this is a new public body because it started only in 2017, but it's a very active one. So the levels of inspections, for example, that they are doing today are very, very important. And they are producing changes in life. So one small example, and I shut up. During the COVID pandemic, all the prisons in Argentina, and many other places, were locked down completely. So no visitors during months. And visitors in Argentina, in many other Latin American countries, are not only important because of the affective and relational elements of the visits, but also because they bring food and they bring things, material things that you need in order to survive inside prison. So this was a huge problem, as you can imagine, for prisoners, and there was a huge level of prison unrest during the first months of the lockdown in the COVID pandemic. This public body and other ones at the provincial level recommended to the prison services to authorize cell phones for prisoners in order to keep their contact with their families. Cell phones has always been inside prison. I have done quite a lot of work inside prison. Cell phones are all over, but are illegal, but you can buy it. They're very, very expensive, but you can buy it. But they decided to, in some jurisdiction, not in all the provinces, to authorize them. And now, after the pandemic has gone, prisoners still have their cell phones authorized. For example, in the province of Buenos Aires, where we have 50,000 prisoners, of which 44,000 have a cell phone. And this is in some way the result of the intervention of these bodies in which the human rights movements have a very strong say, because some of the commissioners came from the human rights organizations and are selected from the human rights organizations. And it has produced a huge change in prison life. I have been doing interviews with prisoners about this, and they say, well, you know, when a guard is arriving to our wing, we just take out the phones because that is already useful to protect us from any kinds of abuse or ill treatment, because you know you can be recorded,
Right.
You can be video recorded. It's a very interesting prevention of torture tool, the cell phone. Also, it has other uses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. If you'll permit me, I wanted to ask a question that is perhaps a bit outside of your case study, but if we still sort of within the context of mass incarceration in Latin America. Just to say, I wanted to ask a question about El Salvador and Bukele. I am very much a sort of external observer. My research is focused on the US, but as sort of from an external perspective, it seems as though Bukele's politics and what he's done to the carceral state in El Salvador is something sort of very new. It represents a kind of rupture from what came before. And in some way, I mean, you mentioned the sort of political history of California. It seems to an American observer that Bukele been able to do what, you know, the former governor of California, Pete Austin, was never able to, right? He's sort of completed this massive transformation of the carceral state and carceral capacity. And not only does it seem as though he's been quite politically successful domestically in El Salvador in doing it, but he's also inspired a kind of wave, it seems, of political imitators across Latin America. There are people in proposing similar politics across other countries in Latin America. And also, I think, interestingly, conservative American political elites love him, right? So there's a congressional delegation from the Senate that went to visit Bukele and came back to us saying, oh, he's brought freedom to El Salvador, and these sort of techniques of governing in terms of criminal justice are things that we should bring back to federal criminal justice policy. So I guess my question is sort of, to what extent is this wave of punitive populism that Bukele seems to have inspired something new, or sort of where does it sit in the political or social tradition that you've talked about here? And also, what should we make of the fact that it seems to have sort of returned to the North in this interesting way?
It's a fascinating topic. I myself didn't do research on El Salvador case, but as many others interested in this kind of topics has tried to follow, the information about the penal experiment in El Salvador. And I am particularly interested in this Bukele effect, we can call it, in Latin American politics today, because we are seeing different examples of, transforming El Salvador in a model to take decisions. The most recent one has been Ecuador, in which President Noboa, after the huge crisis of violence and the, let's say, the different connections between state and organized crime in Ecuador, have just announced the creation of two very big prison complex, following the model of the last prison complex built by Bukele's government. And in my own province, where I live, the governor is constantly producing these videos that have been a very important element in the first moment of Bukele turn towards a form of penal, I would rather say authoritarianism more clearly, and the punitive authoritarianism. And I think it's a scary moment of, particularly in a scary moment of Argentinian politics in general, this peculiar, let's say, connection with El Salvador is really, so they show, for example, prisoners almost naked in the floor with these police officers with strongly armed, ill-treating prisoners, in fact, violating laws, video recorded by the government that then publicize it. So I am still waiting for prosecutors to begin, criminal investigations on these prison officers. But and I think that the effect is really, really happening, and it's happening a lot. Since I didn't do research on El Salvador and I didn't know in detail, I am a bit cautious about how we can label this. But I think that my first impression, I would rather say, is that we can think that we are witnessing a change in this traditional punitive populist trends in Latin America, because it's strongly connected with an explicit, let's say, disregard in relation to the most basic principles of the rule of law and human rights rules. And I think that's interesting, because in many of the punitive populist actors in Argentina, in the different waves, there were always these ideas that we have to be hard with crime, respecting human rights. No, and now it looks like we are witnessing, not only in the case of Bukele, but also in Brazil before with the Bolsonaro government, and now in Argentina with Milei government. We are looking at it in this first month, a discourse that explicitly, publicly, that we have to really displace these concerns about human rights. of course, in the previous waves, also these concerns were practically displaced, but not rhetorically displaced. They were, in the rhetoric. And I think that it could be important, not only in symbolic terms, but also in practical terms. And when we go back to this incarceration rate, so I don't know why it's not working, but 1,086 is, an outlier, even for Brazilian standards. I mean,
Thank you so much. So I feel like when something really big happens, like a big change, like a punitive turn, something dramatic, we often expect there to be a big cause, something like that's, I think, also what makes the neoliberal penalty thesis so persuasive, because it sort of suggests a big change at the structural level of how the economy is organized, which then sort of causes this kind of big punitive turn. And in your talk, you were sort of very much challenging the sort of big causality or single causality explanation. But listening to you, I was wondering whether you're not only challenging the independent variable, as it were, but also the dependent variable, as in, I was wondering whether you're also actually challenging the whole idea of a punitive turn, that actually the kind of complexity you were talking about are not just at the level of causality, but also at the level of the phenomenon you're trying to explain, when the punitive turn, when you dissect it, actually looks more like a punitive pendulum almost, right? When there's constant back and forth, and yet all these punitive struggles. So like just looking at the slide explaining the punitive turn, I was actually wondering, are you still doing that, or are you explaining something which is much more complex?
yes, very interesting point. In fact, I have been dealing with exactly what your question is suggesting in recent times quite a lot, and my idea of continue to use the expression punitive term, it was connected with this contrast that I included today because I think it's important in order to understand the transformations also of punishment and society debates in the global north. I think that these things that are going on in these other places of the world really is pushing the discussion towards other direction, in which increased punitiveness is not at the center of the debate. But when I did the same exercise in the Latin American countries, I found this. And that's why, as a reaction to this contrast, I think that we need to still use an expression like this one, probably not the same, but because beyond the struggles, beyond the complex trends in one direction and the other, the overall result continues to be, in some cases, an amazing, terrible, horrible trend of increasing punitiveness, and not only in the case of El Salvador, that of course it's very, very strong, but also in other cases. As you can see, this is only 10 years. So Bolivia has 123% more prisoners in 2022 than in 2010. It's a huge thing that has happened in a very small amount of time. So you can see there are 5 countries in which the incarceration rate has grown more than 100% in only the last decade. So, but I agree that we are not, I particularly in the case of Argentina, I don't think that I am looking at a trend that is constant and is constantly going exactly in the same direction as a result of the same forces and processes. No, I don't think it is the case. But the overall result is that we have now 227 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. And in 1992, we had 62. So this is a huge change. And that's why I think that still we need a way of, without the complexities of capturing this big change in a way, because this is still a big change. Yeah.
Can I ask you, on the back of that, a question about the indicator? So you mentioned at the beginning that in the kind of comparative and global analysis of punishment, people commonly kind of note the difficulties of incarceration rates as an indicator of punitiveness, and then continue to use it. One, because it's one of the few reliable indicators that people have available. But I guess one of the advantages of doing the kind of situated historical sociology of one place that you've done is you have access to other kinds of indicators. So I'm wondering, in the Argentinian case, if you tell a more kind of complex story, do the other kind of indicators kind of just reinforce what prison rates are telling you, or are there ways in which that story gets either complicated, or are there kind of counter indicators or counter trends that you encounter?
It's a very important point. Thank you. As you said, in a single national case, you can build other kind of statistical indicators around the levels of suffering produced by the penal system. That probably the problem that they have when you want to do a comparative thing is that they do not match well with what can be produced in other national contexts. In the case of Argentina, I have been using a lot of sentencing data. That is a database that I have constructed myself from the start. So going back to books, actually, books in which the sentences were, because the state didn't do it. So I have there indicators about the amount of convictions, the type of convictions, the effective, what we call effective convictions and suspended convictions, because you can be, when you are a first offender, you can be convicted, but your sentence is suspended when the sentence is not a big one. It's up to 3 years of imprisonment. Then you have prison convictions and alternatives to prison convictions. And then you have indicators about the amount of time of the prison sentence. When you look at all these 5 indicators throughout this 40 years period, it matches perfectly well the incarceration rate. And I didn't bring it, I only mentioned that before, but I didn't bring it because I have to put all the 5 there. So when we talk about the indicators that are available, not easily available, but still available around the criminal justice system, this is the what we can say. But we need other indicators. For example, we need indicators about police killings. Police killings in our countries, in some of our countries, more than in others, but it's a very important social fact. And it's a way of producing punitiveness beyond, let's say, the law in many occasions, but it has a very important result, a person that has been killed by a police officer. But the problem is that, for example, in Argentina, where we have 27 different police forces, we don't have a single national database on prison killings. And in fact, of these 27, in 22 of them, we don't have a single data on that. We don't have even, we don't know how many people have been killed by police officers in the last year. So we have there a very strong problem. We cannot enter into that dimension. We had, and I have been using this, that is a proxy in a way, a very interesting work done by the human rights organization in Buenos Aires City, the Center for Social and Legal Studies, that they have been counting the police killings that appear in 4 newspapers in the city of Buenos Aires. So they have been reading newspapers since 1990 till yesterday and counting the police killings that are informed in the newspaper, that of course are not an exact data of the reality of the police killings. So we have there really important problems in the case of Argentina. And then going back to talk about the life inside prison, it's a day in a prison in Buenos Aires in 1992 was not exactly the same as a day in a prison in Oslo in 1992, although the levels of incarceration were the same. But we can build indicators about punitiveness inside prison life. For example, the number of people that die inside prison, both by violent causes or non-violent causes. There, we have some indicators in Argentina in some of the jurisdictions, not for the entire country. So at the federal level, we have reliable indicators of death, and I have been using it. And again, in this case, they match perfectly well the transformations of the incarceration rate. I am not saying that this will be always the case. And I am not saying we can have data on police killings, the result will be the same, because it's quite understandable that could be very different, because it's another kind of practice in another kind of environment, far away from, let's say, legal proceedings. So, but we don't know it. And the problems that we see in Argentina can be seen in many of the Latin American countries. It's very difficult to use these alternative indicators. And that is why we finish relying on incarceration rate. That is, of course, a big problem.
Thank you very much. We can carry on this conversation, but we can do so over wine and some food. So anyone who wishes to do so, you'd be very welcome to hang around. Before we do it, I should thank you for the excellent thing.
Is everything?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, because I'm not
Yeah.
left when you're jumping up. So on the point of that capacity and then in the oh, there is a negative message, which is that judges will very often not even reflecting the but the margins are low level. I'm not going to require capacity for process. And there is no capacity in to integrate the problem about that is that it's the lack of it's much harder to prove.
Then it's exactly the same as saying if they know that there is capacity. Now I read about it in the papers here, like last month. We talked again about the printing capacity, like in the news again here. And Israel, there's something else. Israel that is not possible. However, you have a law that tells the prison authority you have to release people. Prison capacity. And that's yeah. I guess it's really problematic. It undermines the whole career because they don't work for anymore because they're not really. They prefer not to get full.
No, I see.
Because then they are released anytime. I wrote a paper about that in Hebrew, but about what it is without made daily. So every day the prison authority counts how many prisoners they have. The number that they released more. What's happened was I did not know whether he's going to release the family.
I guess it's the left. Yeah, no, you're fine. I feel like you're at least the left.
Currently, everybody gets the what we call
I think black out. I rarely do, but
person, you will get the maximum because the number is much above
my new actually my new resolution is
now.
That's more of a long.
Yeah, that's a different. And yeah, from 3 years ago, 20,000. Of course, many of them are only in the last few months. But even before that, they've been dramatic. Like 2003, when you think about 14,000, 3,000, that's before the.
Fragmented. That is hard.
And it's actually when you're grounding or whether it's just deliberately
I love it. It's very cute. You know, like, it looks really good. As soon as I get to my son, my favorite, you know, that like right before Christmas. And I went home and I was like, sleep, water.
Yeah, I think they are direct.
How's that rating?
Yeah, I think like something about the
I can like get back into it. I'm going great, but I feel like the whole road of extra work, so. But I know, like maybe start to get it back on Monday.
Find the ingredient, you reveal
Like I'm at a weird stage, like I know when I do keto, what I need. They're just kind of separate on that basis. We've been in the process of putting together a panel for that conference. Well, we put it together. The deadline already happened. It was all set, and then there were 7 panelists. 4 of them dropped out. The deadline was and Rachel is going away for 2 weeks now. So basically, she WhatsApped me and was like, "Would you be able to handle this?" So I've been in like frantic back and forth with the organizers who are on US time, so they're in Colorado, basically being like, "Can we please let this go ahead?" Not because I swear that's because I did all the research, like it's the panel I organize, and I'm like so annoyed by these academics. I sent reminders. I sent emails that they're like,
yeah.
I told
in the United States, you know, litigation.
and I was going to hire, I did registration.
Because
It's like, yeah, you have people
which is maybe 3 capacity, but
yeah, I don't know, but that's so, and she's gonna be just
because of that,
she's gonna.
yeah. And then that studies like that.
I just know that she was afraid to travel. That
National level.
right.
Yeah. And another factor.
So she had pulled out, but that was
I advocated this in the article. In your job, when you think about someone take into account the same person in prison, you will many other people from prison earlier because of the capacity you try. So let's have enough wait.
Yeah, but like not expected.
but not yet.
So the number of
But she's really cool. Yeah, so she was going to be on the panel.
14,000
Had dropped out to the vet, but then I was like, okay, the minimum.
Anyone that
I had made it. That's because I was like,
not in place anymore.
Heard from another person and another. Woke up yesterday, literally, I wouldn't accept any rate from this one.
They may
person.
have
So we basically, so I emailed the organization, I was like, I need to extend the deadline for me, like, give me a chance to help. Actually, Rachel, because then it's not, the reasoning, we asked her to begin with. It's very broad, so that's not going to can either. We asked all the usual suspects. Yeah. What's hard is that Denver is
God, it's depressing.
So it's like not even like it's a poster. You don't know, you're gonna see less one.
I've been to Philadelphia.
And now it's like this one. But it's a little bit. I think when I see the woman who's doing it is a kind of easier.
I'm like,
If I can see someone in the US, I think. So the president's not with the the problem is initially Rachel's kind of not even on for it as she is. She's on holiday for the next few weeks.
America will reach it.
So I'm totally she's on sabbatical. She's allowed to go on holiday.
Somehow when they're in the process,
I know, I was like, she's going to Cambodia. She had to run the ISP program for a few years. She deserves a break. Enjoy her sabbatical, but I'm like, I need to right now. So I'm totally, but I like literally all day yesterday, I was gonna try to start meetings again. And instead of just me an email like.
But the language.
How's it going? That's all. And the thing is, now that I know that they're gonna. It is what it is. You Clint, let me know what I need to do.
no,
Don't make me in charge. I'm so I will talk to Rachel. Okay, she also wants me to put a panel together for the BSC. Okay, that's fine. She still wants me to put a panel together for the next BSC. And for the BSC. I don't know if I'm gonna do BSC. I think I'm gonna do BSC and like I'm gonna do a BSC. I think I'm gonna do BSC at the British Club because Rachel usually it's not very good here. Why I thinking about is Great. So I'm gonna do that. It's not only huge. So I'm taking a little bit. I'm gonna try to go around here. Big abstract. The usual thing with it.
One of the reasons why, I mean, I've done nothing
Usually what it depends on if you're added to a paper, if your paper is fast, from an individual, what they usually do is they put you wherever you want. You know what I mean? So if they add you to a paper channel, it's your paper when you get processed. It depends on the logistics of like that. When I organize this for the LSA, make sure it's on the table because it's making it. And it's an either way. Yeah. It's a bit of a too. So I don't know. I have a lot of random paper ideas. I don't have any actual so I'm like, I have. A series of undeveloped thoughts. Yeah. There's nothing under that chair.
Then in order the innocent people. You need to. You're running.
The problem is that
Usually I always it's fine to die.
already takes on. It's very hard to distinguish.
You can't even have a cloud case like and
Yeah. Perspective. Look at
I did like a lot of stocks. So I'm explaining my bag is still
There's no.
I thought it's not
Yeah. What I.
That was.
And the defense, the security,
They don't. When you are.
I know. I know. The question is whether within agree, can you agree to overturn?
In that mental health picture.
And that's taken. Yeah, I don't know. Are there any other because I don't think there is. So what you agree, and it's starting to agree in next generation. We all thoughts of education. No,
My dad said it's very
no.
You're like, I have one year to go.
Please don't. Yeah, I'm just talking about what.
Why I'm looking for.
Yeah, students can do that.
All right.
Then I had a really good idea.
No. Out of less much more. The problem with different islands, I usually also quietly walk in.
Your book doing it.
It's amazing. I'm going to look at if I can now stop that. Go back and see
What about the number?
Yeah.
It's good.
Okay.
I don't think pretty much. I was struggling. Yeah.
What's interesting is it's been great. Well, that way it's fun, right? It's like, right, and go like, you're like, I'll use it there.
What are you saying?
You have to be.
I'm very excited. I don't think I'm going Like Stevie on like on the filming that they did.
I love 2 years when we see each other. It was filmed on 2 years.
Yeah, she broke it down. She just project. I do like it's here. Sitting in front of you. I was thinking it went to feels like I'm in the middle of
That's like going to a friend of mine without now there's like 3 versions.
Not as charming. Yeah. No. I think that's supposed to be really charming.
Generating just. All right.
That's not working.
All the time. But it was out of context. We just didn't have to. Right. Yes, now that's why we need to. So please do not. He brings the last section. He brings his family. Then why did I? You get your content. I just say
What is happening? Let's watch it.
I know one that's happening.
Let's talk about it now. I really like it.
All right. Yeah. The thing about that is actually work.
enjoy your dinner. Let's take.
That is like
So I'm serious. I guess.
that's what it is.
Both take that.
Anything I talk about. So I don't present that as a goal. Oh, it's really. Oh my God. I'm so excited. Yeah. I'm probably the top. Yeah.
So we now be.
I'm so excited. Okay.
Yeah. I'd be proud of the. When you see now, I'm not very good on the 21. So we're not going to tell you.
The concept is
So you kind of join like the last speak up to this. So you just get it. She might be like, no, she might be.
Well, she's a local person. They're both pretty. I just had a great. Yeah, every time something flavor, either. She was famous. They got thrown out by some new regime. Sometimes when it's that's what I answered. Yeah, I decided that Alan Bushbridge says it into the same thing. A good oath. Probably still friends, and Julian Assange accused of being these and that's when they down the rest of well, what happened next? Hold on.
So we. Or
You said there was. Someone who's giving up going to the cinema. I'm going to teach you. Anti-Oxford here. It's your worst film. It's going to be a team. That's It'll be a good bad film. It's an ambiguous ending. Netflix Oh, I hate it.
She ended up for 3 months.
No, like the ambiguous ending.
She was.
Did you start with That's an ambiguous ending.
It is how you mentioned things.
Yeah, right. So you can actually have that's the story. That's so when you planning on staying in
It could be next name, you know, Spain has, I said, legal situation also because legal safe to work easy.
Something.
But it's probably not taking it about this. The worst I shouldn't say things, it was your first match. If any of them coincide, but it's 6 categories.
If you have the same worst movie.
We already have the same.
There's always that
Same worst movie.
There's no words to carry out. I think there probably should be.
And she, there's constantly showing and changing and things.
Oh, you look at this category of one. But in Spain, that's how she appeared. Was winning new with Bruce Willis.
We love it. We love
He's in the top 10 this movie. I'm looking for him to go.
You know, the school work. We need
But I'm embarrassing.
Yeah, no, that's. But you've seen the other ones.
Yes.
That was, no, there's not. I'm not in story. In story. Yeah. My stepson.
That's okay.
I think that's all.
See, I've never seen the dog walk backwards.
Oh, me neither.
So, I think that's.
It's the same 6 months pay, which is the best one.
All five
It's on this week. That's worth saying.
I didn't.
It's happening. It's a big one. Having that big. And I'm not spoiling this because it has an ambiguous ending.
Well, they're still waiting for the system thing too. What's that one?
Wonderful paper.
And also,
I think also those are going to back in the
minus 19.
So what was the best Marvel ice cream involved?
That's a good question.
But if you watch all of them, and then one time it's
Never did, right.
I had to have a secret.
Steps
So he decided, no, he knows that he has not.
Yeah, somewhere on the spectrum.
You don't know what's going on. So if you start watching it out again.
How many are there?
You should have put this out there to the correct stuff.
And they're all one story. One
Wait,
story.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're one story.
Oh, I don't.
So they're all, there's all these obscure connections between them all.
Oh, cool.
And they don't come out in the story order.
Yeah.
You can watch them in the order. So what's that the one with what's the name?
I have never been.
So that came out recently,
Yeah.
but it's just into a music. That was like 14 or 13.
I did not know that.
You reach minus 24.
Winter's book for just.
What? Because I am doing here.
I'm guessing.
And the work.
Origin stories, and the back stories.
Guardians of the Galaxy takes property.
Oh,
That's not. Yeah.
And then there's.
More than 15 degrees in some places. Yes, in Argentina, not. That's a great phenomenon with
Showing the BBC in 30 years. That's almost exactly the same screen.
Yeah, but the other thing, right? It's only just 30 things. Happening. And we have
You can understand all
You were down like nonsense.
That's why
he sort of seems to be although he's not number one.
I did You dressed up so brown. I missed that for you. Yeah, actually, I I did too, but like, very good, very much again.
Thank you for.
Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Or do you have it to
I really like that. Yeah. I thought it was, I didn't like it. I saw my, and then I said about it so much. He was so good, so funny. But I just felt like it was hyped up so much. It was just like, it's kind of left.
This might be a football club, isn't it?
No.
No,
It's not, but I know, yeah.
Oh, that's no, it's netball part of your set.
The guy, I think there's one of the hot actor.
Right?
Who were rich. A whole series about it. Yeah. Me, I didn't like it. Yeah, my man. The other guy. The guy destined to be known as the other guy.
What's described as a famous film actor in something recently? I don't know. No, really.
Wow, it's like George Michael and the other guy.
Andrew Ridgely, or even Rose.
I would not want to be Ryan Reynolds' friend.
I'm going to leave with, I want to have it in a one. In a one video.
No.
Wow.
No.
Which Which song?
I was like, break it up before you go.
No.
It was filmed in the Marquee Club.
You had to be there.
Well, I was just working for Hartley Goldsmith. It was key, but never took the key. I was leaving, hanging around.
It's so fantastic. I think that snippet pop.
Obviously, I only had a taxi insurance. This claims the train. I'll show mine. Right, thank you for your hospitality. I'm going to find out about China in the Middle East. Which is pretty easy to say.
No, you didn't. Quite early on.
I lived in London.
You had a second. It's
Yeah.
He comes every time.
Yeah, we go. We can annoy us each time. What's your favorite movie? I could give you a few of my favorites. Give us two minutes. I can't. Are you have to agree?
My favorite children's movie is Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins. Yeah. But that's tied up with the fact that I watched with my kids, man. You can't just talk.
Wait, Mary Poppins movie. I didn't watch the movie.
Até porque eu acho que é mais fácil.
So good.
Depois voltar
Love.
do que voltar agora. E eventualmente aí é muito mais difícil de fazer lá. Então, então
The suffragette mom.
e antes de vir para cá, eu ia voltar direto do Brasil.
The right side of a honey.
That is a lot.
Mas ainda assim,
Okay, so Mary Poppins is one of your favorites. That's very
para morar em São Paulo, agora assim, com 3
You don't
filhos.
have to carry one around in my head, obviously.
Aí eu
So that's
que sabe que eu quero. E também
Okay.
é muito
has medieval times, it tends to be nice so that you can adjust in competition.
How can you go with
You have to analyze that.
Why have we a gente não gasta nada com
a second and a third.
Still something with it.
básica, os gastos.
Well, you used to marry.
Yeah, but that was done because it was in the category. Another category, a bit stump.
You would be like over and over and over different people.
So basically that's
E
like a
então,
Você foi.
Wow.
e o supermercado? O supermercado aqui,
that you cannot go out.
conversão. Às vezes é mais barato que no Brasil. Então, a verdade é
For when the funeral Christmas.
não, porque a gente tá de vez em quando. Se eu, claro,
I think it's one thing for free, from Love Actually cancelled. So not something always actually possible under the great survival of the Philippines. Yeah.
eu teria esse que respeitar para trabalhar. Mas é aquilo.
That's
A
it.
grande maioria tem assim, mais grande, é meio mais
I actually really like
É
it.
difícil, né? Porque sim, pelo
But
menos.
we want to. Or maybe I should.
É, claro.
Yeah.
Mas eu acho
Well, I really like how about your name. I really like the vibe. I'm following good films. I really like that. She's important. I never think new films. Because a lot of my favorite films are like nostalgic. Okay, yeah. I have one nostalgic. Singing in the Rain. Yeah, I love Richard Linklater. Exactly. That's what we went through. Those are really great songs. Yeah. Well, okay. I feel like there's some people who are like favorite people, and there's some people who like they're not favorite people.
que você
Like, I'm a favorite person. Like I know my favorite. I'm not. Okay.
Eu acho que esse é um dos
Okay.
pontos que
Yeah, I don't think I
eu
know.
vim para cá.
Okay. But I'm really, that means you like love. Yeah, I guess.
We showed me a big list.
Like, what's your favorite, like,
Mano, gostei mais que o. E quando eu vim para cá, não. E aí eu tinha muito receio de não conseguir me adaptar.
Yeah, it could be summer or winter.
Ia ficar no trabalho.
So,
Wait, what's your favorite?
Mas eu já comecei a dar aula antes.
No, that's way Okay, so what's your favorite color?
A pandemia, de certa
you can
forma,
only one food.
Yeah.
isso menos difícil, porque era online.
Oh, cuisine.
Então, você está vendo o pessoal já.
There's not just the
Quebrei o gelo na educação, menos desconfortável.
If you could only.
E hoje em dia, você está vendo
Potatoes, right? Which one would you have? Yeah.
eu tô
That's what you like. You can just choose between bread, pasta, potatoes.
Sabe aquela ponte?
Yeah, I think so. What's yours? I did rice. Oh my god!
Sempre passado, eu estava dando uma em outra escola.
That's fascinating.
Ele terminal.
Okay, so let me finish.
It's not my favourite food, so I think
Sim, é variedade.
I don't want to eat that much like that. Like a boy eating Italian food.
I feel like Mediterranean food is my favorite.
Yeah.
But if I only had one dish that I would ever eat, it would be pad thai.
Yeah,
Like,
oh,
oh,
it's very
go
good.
away. Love. But where is the good pad thai?
Agora, claro, tem vários próximos, também tem as partes mais difíceis. Você vai ter
George Street.
uma casa de gigante,
Bad.
quase tem.
Is it the good market?
Mas sempre algo novo. Eu não
It's
consigo
good. It's like
reciclar
greasy pad thai.
muito assim, material. Então é algo que para mim toma mais tempo, entendeu? Então agora, eu sempre
Really
daquela.
nice.
Então, nesses tutoriais, fazer isso. É mais fácil de eu aceitar.
It's like comparing a heavy with
Yes.
Multiple times a week.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And
Actually, you did an amazing climb place all this time.
No, so they now.
I did pay you
The demo.
to 6 years old.
Every other Friday.
Again.
They can pop up.
Is that, porque reciclar material.
No, that one is. Wait, I'm gonna tell you. We'll go.
Yeah. Oh my God. Like this.
Yeah.
It's like a bear. Like that, but then.
I think I'm gonna do these.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Thank you very much. You, so. Possible.
Here.
I'm just throwing my phones around. Oh,
Yes.
my phone, my multiple ones. No, pockets. For my other identities.
devices.
It's a bit drop in the toilet, so yes.
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 Yeah, you took your like highlighting thing. It's close this. Is anyone on the candidate? We're not thinking red wine.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is.
So maybe.
That should.
I have rescued my phone several times.
Really? As in, it drops in. And it's been well afterwards. Wow.
I didn't make them rice, but it was
Not good. With rice.
yeah, I don't know why I didn't.
Which I see.
Which
Yeah. No, you can give back.
And I really want to come to.
No, you can do.
Okay,
People
that's
teaching
that's
here,
actually.
yeah, meetings in here. So those are three main purposes.
Perfect.
For example, CDMA.
More.
I could bring it here, but we just always teach in the centre because it makes sense.
No,
So it's there. Yeah, so I could use that room. If I wanted to do it available.
And the people is because they like the room or.
Well, they don't have to. I mean, criminology is different from lots of other bits of criminology. Actually, lots of them just space that. So we have, because we have dedicated territory, we tend to use it.
But more and more.
We were just in the north. And in this case, so you can use this one instead. Yeah, and and you would.
Seriously.
I'm never gonna have braces.
Should we get going?
I'm just opening a bowl of wine, but I know if we're getting going.
I actually find it so funny.
We.
Maybe you can take the bottle with you.
We've got 20 minutes, so there's no rush, and it's only 5 minutes away.
Yeah.
So shall I carry on?
Sure.
Is it
Thank you.
Carry on.
That's a bit.
then you can go to a restaurant and pay, so they like.
Yeah, they do some restaurants you can take your own.
Yeah, but if they've not got a license, I think.
Yeah.
No, no. Is that
It depends on what. You can take your own wine and they charge you because
I will charge you a portage charge.
Yes.
Yeah, but if they have their own license, they don't want you to do that. They want you to buy theirs.
Interesting.
We're just. Yeah. How are you finding Edinburgh so far?
Very well. You know, I have been there 2 months last year, so it's my second time. I the city is beautiful. I am living now in Morningside Road, just street. Very fancy. You know, I am a fancy person, don't you think so? Yeah. No, that's a fantastic story because, you know, when I am now a legal film visiting professor, so I have some money to rent. And the prices in Edinburgh are completely crazy. I mean, when I said crazy, I mean
Anyone else? No, of course.
very expensive, amazingly expensive. So when I began to look for some apartments, well, the prices were very high, and in order to get some, let's say, reasonable price, you have to go very outside the center. And I found in Airbnb this place that says, 2 months, this rent. It's quite cheap. And it says Morningside Road. And I said, well, that's a good thing. There has to be a secret or something, because why it's not so expensive as the other places. But I started to, communicate with the landowner.
Secondary.
And the place is perfect, we can, Leon, my kid has some room, very nice, in the window, and he's 11. Yeah, and so he has his own, he brings his computer, play, everything. And he has a very beautiful room with a window like this. Right? So he's very, very famous. And it really didn't cost a lot. And it's amazing because all the prices were completely crazy. So I'm very happy. So Morningside Road, it's the place is Church Hill Street.
Too much detail.
Dominion.
Do not we go too much detail? But I know where Morningside is.
Yeah, beautiful.
That's cold.
Is
It
it
is,
still
but
in-
well,
It's
I
great.
came from Argentina, so
What
everything is cool. In comparison with my country, everything is cool.
Are we being watched? Is the question.
Oh,
Ah, maybe.
sorry, I abandoned my, oh gosh, I think we might even still be recording.
That'll be an interesting thing to post on our website.
These guys
Like,
drinking
you're
wine.
some sort of like reality show like in Japan.